vivid versions.
So here's the part you need to know before any of this makes sense. Raina and I had been together 2 years and 3 months. Not that I was counting. I just remember because our anniversary was the weekend before all of this started, and I'd taken Friday off work, driven 40 minutes to pick up a reservation I'd made 6 weeks in advance at a place she'd mentioned once, offhand, in October. Not a hint, just a mention. I'd written it down on my phone notes the way I write down everything I don't want to forget, and 6 weeks later I made the call. That's the kind of thing I did. Not because I needed credit for it, because that's what you do when someone matters to you. Her name was Raina. His name, the friend at the center of this, was Brid. And I know what you're thinking because everyone thinks it, and I'll address it. Brid and I have been friends for almost 7 years. We'd worked together briefly being the operative word, and then she'd moved to a different department, and we'd stayed friends the way adults sometimes stay friends when they actually like each other as people. She'd been at my mother's birthday dinner. She called me the night my grandfather died, just to sit on the phone. That kind of friend. The kind you don't explain. Raina knew all of this. She met Brid 4 or 5 times. They'd always been pleasant. I had no reason to think otherwise. We were sitting on the back patio. It was a Tuesday just after 8 glasses of wine, the kind of quiet evening that feels like nothing is wrong with anything. And then Raina put her glass down. I noticed the way she set it down, too deliberately, the way someone sets something down when they've been rehearsing what comes next. And she said, "I just think it's time you chose who actually matters to you." I didn't say anything right away. She said chose. Past tense implying present action required. She's already decided where this is going. She let it sit there for a second, then told me. Brid had apparently, at a get-together 2 weeks prior, one I hadn't attended, pulled her aside and made a pass at her, touched her arm, said something ambiguous that Raina had interpreted as flirtatious, let it linger. I looked at Raina. She was watching me the way people watch you when they want to see what you'll do before they tell you what they want you to do. She hasn't said, "I was uncomfortable." She said, "It's time you chose." That's not a report. That's an ultimatum dressed as a disclosure. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I picked up my glass. I thought, 2 weeks. She'd sat on this for 2 weeks. We'd had 4 or 5 evenings together since then, ordinary evenings, and she'd said nothing. And now, on a Tuesday, she'd set down her glass and pulled the pin. I told her I was glad she told me, and I meant it, and I said I need to think about what she'd shared. She looked like she'd expected something else. I kept my voice even and warm because I felt it. I want to be clear about that. I felt the thing she'd named. I just needed to know whether it was real before I acted on it. And that's when I started doing the math. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was upset in the way she may have wanted me to be upset. Not ready to fire off a message to Brid or draw some line in the sand. But because something was sitting wrong and I needed to figure out what it was. Here's what I knew. I'd been with Raina for 2 years and 3 months. In that time, I could count on one hand the number of close friendships she'd encouraged me to maintain. Her ex from before me. No contact, she'd asked once, and I'd agreed without much protest because it seemed reasonable. A former co-worker she'd met at my work holiday thing. She'd been cool toward him ever since in a way I'd noted but not challenged. My college roommate, who lived 3 hours away and visited maybe twice a year. She'd been visibly irritable both times he'd stayed with us and had made comments afterward that I'd absorbed without responding to because I was tired and it hadn't felt worth the fight. I told myself, she just needs time to feel secure. I gave her time. I gave her 2 years and 3 months of time. 3 people, 3 times. The pattern is what makes it a pattern. I canceled plans with Brid once, back in the fall, when Raina and I had an early conflict about how much time I spent with friends, and I'd adjusted because I thought it was fair. I'd adjusted. I'd paid attention. I'd kept dinners to a reasonable frequency, included Raina whenever possible, Never let a friendship become a reason to make her feel secondary. Because I didn't want her to feel secondary. Because she mattered to me. She hadn't come to the get-together 2 weeks ago. She'd said she wasn't feeling well. I'd gone alone, stayed 2 hours, came home. Britt had been there. They hadn't crossed paths, which meant I had no witness to corroborate what Raina was describing, except Britt herself. The accusation is about someone she's met 4 times. The behavior she's describing isn't characteristic of anyone who's ever met Britt. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it means I owe Britt a conversation. Here's what I also knew: the dinner. 6 weeks of planning, 40-minute drive, the restaurant she named once and never mentioned again. She cried a little at the table. Happy, she said. I believed her. But that was 9 days before this conversation. And here we were. 2 years, 3 months. For holidays managed largely by me because she found family gatherings exhausting. 3 nights in a row, I'd stayed up late, reviewing her presentation because her manager had blindsided her with a restructure and she needed someone who could rent a room. The night she'd gotten bad health news, not catastrophic but scary, and I'd clear my calendar for a week, quietly, without announcement, just so I could be available. I'm not cataloging this for points. I'm cataloging it because I was not a man who had given her reason to feel insecure. And if she felt insecure anyway, that was worth understanding. But not before I knew what had actually happened. I need to talk to Britt, not to catch anyone, to know. I texted Britt the next morning and asked if she had time for a call. She called within the hour because that's who she is. I told her I needed to ask her something directly and I needed her to be honest with me. She said okay. I told her what Raina had described. There was a pause, not a guilty pause, not a calculating pause, but the pause of someone trying to understand what they're hearing. She said, I barely spoke to her. She wasn't there. And that was that. She wasn't there. Not I didn't do that. Not a denial requiring any further processing. The geometry of the accusation didn't hold because the premise didn't hold. Raina hadn't been at the get-together. Britt and Raina had been in the same room for maybe 20 minutes at the last party they'd both attended, which was in January, and there had been nothing. No friction. No incident. Britt had gone home early. I thanked her. I told her I'd handle it. She said chose. That word landed differently now. Not as an accusation. As a test. One she designed and administered without my knowledge. I drove home. I made dinner. I waited. This kind of thing ends relationships. I'll say it once. She was in the kitchen when I got back. We ate together, and I was warm through dinner because I'm always warm at dinner. And afterward, I poured her a glass of water, and she poured me one, and we moved to the living room, and I sat across from her. Not beside her, across, and I said, I spoke with Britt. I know what happened. She looked at me. There it is, the half second before the story pivots. She said she didn't know what Britt had told me, but Britt would obviously deny it. Of course. That's the prepared position. I didn't respond to that. I let it finish landing, and then I said, she wasn't there. Raina. She wasn't at that get-together. Raina's face did something. Not guilt, not immediately. First to try to find a different version of a story that might still hold. She said she might have the event wrong, that maybe it was a different time, that she'd been feeling strange about Britt for a while, and maybe she'd conflated. She's rebuilding. Watch where the new foundation goes. I said, I'm not interested in the sequence of how you're remembering it. I'm interested in what you told me 2 nights ago and whether it was true. She went quiet. And I want you to understand that I wasn't enjoying this. I wasn't sitting across from her feeling anything that looked like satisfaction. She said it. Not in one clean sentence. It came out in pieces, and she kept stopping and starting, and I let her. I didn't help her. I didn't finish her sentences. I didn't soften the room by reaching across and taking her hand, even though some part of me wanted to, because this moment required that I stay exactly where I was. She said she'd been scared. She said she needed to know if I would choose her. She said she thought that if she put it this way, she'd see what I actually did, and that the friendship had always bothered her, and she just wanted to know if it mattered more to me than she did. I listened to all of it. She chose a test over a conversation. That's the actual information here. When she finished, I said, I don't need the explanation. I need you to understand that this kind of thing ends relationships. I said it once. She looked at me, and I think she understood. Not immediately, not completely, but I think the stillness in the room told her something that another kind of response wouldn't have. And then I got up and washed the 2 glasses and went to bed. What I didn't anticipate was the phone calls. I say that not to be dramatic about it, but because I genuinely hadn't expected the extent to which Raina had been talking to people while I'd been quiet. I told no one. I'd done what I do. I processed privately, talked to the one person directly involved, and said what needed to be said. That was the whole of my campaign. She'd apparently been calling people for 2 days. The first call came from her friend Tamsin, who I liked well enough. She called the morning after my living room conversation with Raina and said she'd heard things were tense and she just wanted to check in. I said I appreciated it. She said Raina had told her about the situation with Brid and that she understood why Raina felt threatened and hoped I could find a way to be compassionate about Raina's anxiety. I'll let her finish. Select the one question that does the most work. I said, did she tell you what specifically Brid did? Tamsin paused. She said, Raina had said Brid had made a pass at her, that she'd been inappropriate at a gathering. I said, did she tell you she wasn't at that gathering? Silence. I thanked Tamsin. I told her I hoped she and Raina had a chance to talk. I ended the call. 20 minutes later, I kid you not, another one came in. This was her colleague Owen, who I'd met 3 or 4 times, who was apparently close enough to Raina that she'd called him into this. He was friendly about it. He said he knew this was none of his business, but he cared about Raina and hoped I was taking her feelings seriously. He said she'd been dealing with some insecurity and that it might be worth asking whether this friendship crossed any lines. I let him finish. He only has her version. He doesn't have the version where she wasn't there. Did she tell you what Brid said to her? He said she described it as a flirtatious comment, a moment that felt inappropriate. Did she mention when or where this happened? He thought for a second. He said a get-together a couple weeks back, he thought. Did she mention whether she was at that get-together? Longer pause this time. He said, I'm guessing she wasn't. I said, I appreciate you calling. The third call came that evening. Her older sister, Cora, who I actually had a real relationship with, who'd been at our anniversary dinner the year before, who'd texted me a photo of a bookshelf I'd recommended once and thanked me for it 2 months later when she'd finished the book. Cora calling felt different. She said Raina was pretty shaken up, that she'd called crying, and that she wanted to understand what was happening. This one matters. Be precise. I'll let her finish. I said, Cora, has Raina told you the full version of what happened? She said she'd heard about Brid, yes. She said she was concerned about the friendship and what it might mean for the relationship. I said, did she tell you she fabricated the incident? That she wasn't present for the event she described? That she told me it happened to test how I'd respond? Silence that lasted long enough that I heard her exhale. She said, she told me she tested you. She said she needed to know. I said, I know what she needed to know. I'm asking whether you have the complete picture. Cora said, very quietly, I don't think I did. I thanked her. I didn't ask her to do anything with that information. I didn't recruit her. I said I hoped Raina and I could work through it, and that it was good to hear her voice. The fourth call was brief. A mutual friend named Locke, who I think genuinely called just to make sure I wasn't spiraling, which I appreciated. He asked if I was doing all right. I said yes. He asked if it was bad. I said it was clarifying. He said that sounded like me and laughed a little. I told him I'd tell him the whole story sometime. The fifth call was from Raina's friend Deo, who came in with a little more heat than the others. She said Raina had been good to me and that she hoped I wasn't going to let a friendship with another woman compromise something real. She said she'd seen too many relationships and over things like this. She thinks I'm choosing Brit. She doesn't know what there is to choose between. I said, "Did Raina tell you what she told me, and what the basis for it was?" Deo said, "She said your friend made her uncomfortable." "Did she tell you she fabricated the incident as a test?" A pause that stretched. "She told me she was scared." I said, "I understand that. That's actually the part I'm trying to figure out with her." Deo went quiet for a moment and then said, in a different tone than she'd called with, Okay, I hear you. That was 5. They all had a version. None of them had the whole thing. That's not their fault. That's the structure of the situation. And this is the part that I still turn over when I think about it. I got a text from Finn. Finn was Raina's closest friend. Had been for years. If she had a person she called first for anything, it was Finn. He and I had a friendly but not deep relationship. He texted and asked if he could call, and when I said yes, he called immediately, which I noted. He didn't start with a defense of Raina. He said, "She told me what she did." The full version. I've been sitting on it for a day, and I felt like I had to reach out. Internal recalibration. He's not in the same category as the others. I waited. He said, "I want you to know that I told her this was wrong. Not the feeling I understand, but the method. I told her she was scared. She needed to say she was scared. I'm not calling to defend her. I'm calling because I think you handled it right, and I wanted you to know that I know that." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "She's going to come around. She's not a bad person. She made a bad call." I said, "I know she's not a bad person. He broke rank, and he knew it, and he called anyway. That tells me something about what her position looks like from inside her own circle." I thanked him and let him go. An hour later, Raina called me from the other room. We were still in the same house, still navigating the uncomfortable geometry of that. And when I answered, she was crying. Not the crying of someone performing emotion. The specific crying of someone who has fully understood what they did and doesn't know what to do with that understanding. She said, "I need you to know that I know what I did." She's leading with the admission this time. Something shifted. I didn't respond to the crying. I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling because everyone I talk to has come back to me with the same thing, and I need to know if there's any coming back from this." I said, "I don't know yet." She said she understood. I said, "I'll tell you when I do." The call lasted 4 minutes. She didn't ask me to forgive her right then. I appreciated that. She said chose. Now she's asking if there's any coming back. The weight of that word is doing exactly what it should. What happened over the next 2 weeks was not dramatic. That's the part that's hardest to describe to someone who is expecting a fight. She started with Brid. She reached out directly. I didn't ask her to, and she apologized. Not a vague, "sorry if this was a problem" message. A real one, specific and honest, that acknowledged what she'd said and why it was wrong. Brid told me about it unprompted, because she wanted me to know, and she said she'd accepted it. That mattered. That mattered more to me than almost anything else that happened in those 2 weeks, because it meant Raina had done something uncomfortable and done it without me standing over her. She made an appointment. She'd been resistant to therapy for years. Not openly hostile, just indefinitely deferring. Something she'd get around to, something that wasn't quite necessary yet. She showed me the booking confirmation the day she made it. I hadn't asked. She put her phone on the counter and said, 3rd of next month. I said good. She gave back access to some space I hadn't realized she'd quietly occupied. And I say occupied because I don't know a better word for the way. Over 2 years, she'd become a kind of gravity in my calendar. Plans were run by her before they were confirmed. A weekend I might otherwise have spent however I wanted was always in some negotiation with what she needed or preferred. She handed me my Saturdays back. Those are my words for it. not hers, by saying unprompted, "You should go do the thing with Locke. I don't need to know the details." I went. It was fine. Nothing had changed except that it was allowed to be fine. She called her sister Cora. I know this because Cora texted me afterward. Not to report, just to say she was glad. That's it. Just glad. 3 letters. The 5th thing was smaller than the others, but it was the one I keep coming back to. There was a habit she had of checking my phone. Not searching through it, nothing that dramatic, but glancing when it lit up, being in the room when I stepped away to take a call, the low-grade surveillance of someone who didn't fully trust what they might find. It stopped. Not because I called it out. I never had. I just noticed it. It stopped because she decided it needed to stop. I didn't say anything. She didn't announce it. I noticed and I filed it. She said chose. She's choosing differently now. That's the answer to the question she was trying to test for. 3 weeks after the patio, we were in the kitchen. This is what I mean about nothing being dramatic. And she was making coffee, and I was reading something, and she said, without build-up, I think I was trying to control something I was afraid of losing. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was watching the coffee. I think I decided testing you was safer than trusting you. And I know that's backwards. I put down what I was reading. That's true, I said. She said, you were right. About what you said. I want to be specific. She didn't say, I think you had a point, or I see where you were coming from. She said, you were right. Full stop. A little later, her friend Deo, the one who'd called with some heat, mentioned it to me when I saw her at something small. She said she'd never seen Raina change course like this, and she said it quickly. And she said, that was fast. I said, fast is fine if it's real. She looked at me for a second like she was deciding whether to push on that, and then she let it go. That was the right call on her part. Here's what I'll tell you, and then I'm done with this story. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You don't have to perform certainty to have it. The stillness you feel when you know what's true, that isn't coldness. It isn't distance. It's just what it looks like when someone stops needing to convince anyone of anything, including themselves. She'd said chose. She wanted to know if I would. The thing she didn't understand, hadn't understood in all the time we'd been together, is that you don't get to know what someone will choose by engineering a choice. You only get to know what they'll do when they think no one's watching, when the test isn't visible, when it's just them and the thing they actually believe. 2 years and 3 months of that. She had it. She just hadn't looked. The most honest thing she ever said to me was the last thing. I think I decided testing you is safer than trusting you. I think she was right. And I think that's the kind of thing that is worth understanding as early as you can. Not for my sake, but for hers. Fear dressed up as strategy doesn't protect you. It just makes you someone who conducts audits in private and calls them relationships in public. I know how that sounds, but sit with it. I just think it's time you chose who actually matters to you. Turns out I already had. She just finally saw it.
Thanks for listening.